It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And it is a very special retro episode today, what I'm calling The Author is Dead special, because it's likely that we'll end up spending a good portion of this episode talking about the author and her life.
And the fact that she is dead.
Yes, and who are we going to be talking about?
So, this entire podcast comes with a giant content warning. Content warning, Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Yes, and that means child abuse, for those who don't know. So,
among other things.
Among other things. So,
child sexual abuse, among
yes,
other things. As
we proceed. We have chosen to delve into this because Marion Zimmer Bradley is...
extremely influential and like historically and important in the history of queer and or feminist science fiction.
Yes, I'd never read any Marion Zimmer Bradley before this. The actual books that we were reading this week are the Renunciate trilogy. Although I imagine we'll probably be spending most of the time that we are talking about the books themselves talking about the second book, which is the best and most interesting of the three of them. By some margin, and that's called Thundara House.
Yes.
So, do we want to proceed with plot, or do we want to just start talking about Marion Zimmer Bradley first?
Do we want first? I mean, are there wizards in this?
Yes,
there's an entire racial cast of pale psychic redheads.
Yes, Irish wizards.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Lesbians? Yes.
Yes.
Very much so. Lesbians, bisexuals, asexual people. Actually, there may not be any asexual people because Marion Zimmer Bradley seems to be under the impression that everybody is so horny all of the time that asking a woman not to have sex for 6 months is a serious imposition. But
yes.
Certainly plenty of lesbians, or lovers of women, as Bradley styles them.
Yes. And they do fight.
They do, although really this is one of those where the wizards are the lesbians, kind of,
yes.
And the direction the book is heading toward is wizard-lesbian complicity.
Yes, though the third book does have wizards and lesbians actually battling.
Yes.
With knives.
I suspect that that the cartoonish evil wizard at the end of the book is probably also a lesbian, but
probably
that's neither here nor there. I mean, she does head an all-female cult, so
it's true.
One must assume that she's dipping a little bit because cult leaders tend to do that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, no,
yes.
Okay, so yes. Why should you read this trilogy other than that it is, I think, Marion Zimmer Bradley's work is historically very significant to understanding, the evolution of queer and feminist science fiction. And if nothing else, at least it's better than The Mists of Avalon, which is the one that everyone will tell you to read.
I can see no reason to read the first and third books.
Right.
Thundara House is interesting.
Thundara House is at least interesting.
It's not, great, but it's not excruciating either.
I would say that the first book has moments where it's interesting.
Yeah, the third book is...
is awful.
Avoid the third book. It's worthless, but
it's completely worthless.
The first book gets better as it goes, and then the second book is, it repeats itself a lot, and it's the longest of the three of them. But
and it kind of feels the third book feels like the longest of the three, but the second book feels quite long.
The third book is actually the shortest of the three. It's just,
and yet it's just real bad.
The second book is worth reading for an insight into. It's like if you took 50s office culture and pitted it against 90s psychology and saw
this is clearly 50s office culture pitted against 60s and 70s feminist separatist commune.
Yes, but the author thinks that everything that 90s psychology had to say was right. So,
except that this book, I'm pretty sure these books predate 90s psychology.
And right off the bat, Isaac is wrong.
Pretty drastically.
Yeah, maybe it's. I mean, these books have a
Just because
big.
this is the weird psychology you were raised under doesn't actually
Okay,
make it from the 90s.
okay, so so all right, so 50s office culture versus the hippie movement, and particularly the Jungian, animist Wicca, monomyth side of the hippie movement. Put it that way.
Yes.
And it's the parts where the woman who comes from the Terran cultural sphere is trying to deal with being indoctrinated into this women's consciousness raising cult are super interesting. And the parts where the woman from the consciousness raising cult is trying to make her way as the new wife of the up and coming manager in the office are excruciating
awful.
and repetitive.
They really are. Yes.
But you'll get the idea really quickly. But there's enough good stuff in the book to make it worth getting through that, particularly if you're able to skim all of the sections with JL in the Terran zone, which I was not.
So, at least according to Wikipedia, Thundara House came out in 1983. So the book is, in fact, exactly as old as we are.
I mean, it makes sense. It felt very familiar, the cultural
Yes,
milieu.
the Shattered Chain, it comes from 1976.
And that makes a lot of sense because the Shattered Chain is also like noticeably poorly written in a way that Thundara House is not. So some progress was made.
Well, some progress was made, and/or it was ghostwritten. You never know.
Or edited more.
Marion Zimmer Bradley. Well, we can get more into her. Oh no! In fact, according to Wikipedia, it was ghostwritten. So yes, we'll get to get all into.
Oh my goodness, that is fascinating.
Oh no! I have so much to tell you about Marion Zimmer Bradley's poor authorship practices.
I'm fascinated.
Let's jump to the spoiler zone.
It's time to go to the spoiler zone. All right, we're not even going to tell you what these books are about because this is mostly about Marion Zimmer Bradley.
I know. I mean, you described it. These books are about a woman who's from the Terran space empire, which is basically the 1950s for some reason. 1950s yes. Office culture for some reason.
I mean, it feels like what Isaac Asimov thought that the future was going to be.
Right, exactly. And she's a spy on a planet that's Marion Zimmer Bradley's famous Darkover, which is an ice planet ruled by a caste of Irish telepaths. Mm-hmm. And, there's been a sort of ongoing culture clash between the Terrans and this feudal telepathic society, which for some reason, Marion Zimmer Bradley's, the authorial sympathies are very much with the racial white supremacist feudal telepaths and not, slightly, and not like 1950s America, which isn't great, but at least, isn't a feudal society.
We'll get into what I think of that. But I also just want to point out that the overall setting is essentially just, as you may have gleaned, taken in whole cloth from the Hainish books.
Oh, yes. No, it is, in fact, the first couple Darkover books were not... Darkover was not an ice planet for the first book, and then she read The Left Hand of Darkness.
I mean,
and after that, Darkover became an ice planet.
blatantly obvious. I actually wanted to start this episode out with a quote from Ursula Le Guin that I happened to stumble across.
Well,
do you mind? Shall I do that and then we can go off to the Stumbler Zone?
Yes.
The Stumbler Zone. The spoiler zone. Okay, quoting from Ursula Le Guin, whose work this borrows heavily from and is much worse than. Quote, "But I didn't and still don't like making a cult of women's knowledge. Yes. Preening ourselves on knowing things men don't know, women's deep irrational wisdom, women's instinctive knowledge of nature, and so on. All that all too often merely reinforces the masculinist idea of women as primitive and inferior." And it goes
boy,
on.
Are these books just a great example of exactly what she's talking about.
Yes. Oh, we should actually do content warnings because there's so many.
Yes, there's so many. So again, first of all, content warning for this podcast is that Marion Zimmer Bradley both enabled her husband's child molestation, and I mean like actively enabled, like helped him find boys to molest. And then after her death, her daughter came forward and said quite convincingly that Marion Zimmer Bradley molested her. So this is two child molesters who basically everyone was aware, especially of what her husband did, in the science fiction community. And basically everybody looked the other way for decades. And this is part of what I mean by this is historically important, because I actually think it's important when we study queer science fiction to talk about the ways in which both the queer community and the science fiction community have enabled a lot of really bad behavior in the past.
Indeed. As for the books themselves...
rape. So much rape.
So much rape. Threatened and on screen.
And off screen. So much biological essentialism.
Transmisandry.
Transmisandry.
Actually...
there's like a turf undercurrent. This is proto-turf, but there's a real turf undercurrent here.
It's actually harder on trans men than it is on trans women, and actually that is a thing that I wanted to point out. This book is misogynist. These books hate women more than they hate men.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
I will argue this.
No, I think you're right.
And
there's a lot of biological essentialism going on in these books. I believe that, like, at one point, one character says, like, biology is destiny or something.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, plenty of, like, your personality is fixed by the age of 12. Like, plenty of discarded, outdated psychological concepts that underpin a lot of these prejudices being taken as objective truth, like scientific truth in these books.
Eugenics.
Eugenics.
Everyone is, like, super in favor of eugenics.
Yes, the good guys are extremely in favor of eugenics.
The entire premise of the Darkover world is that you created this superpowered telepath caste through, like, 1,000 years of eugenics.
Yes. And while there is a black character who is there to be the black character, I would say that it's not great on race.
Oh, no, it's terrible on race.
Just as a general matter. Also, the black character, I just noticed this, that in the third book has long prehensile toes.
Yes!
For some fucking reason.
Right.
Yeah, no. Like, read this... don't read the first and third books. Read the second one as a piece of historical evidence of a different time and a different mindset.
I would argue that you should also read the first book for the same thing, particularly because the first book was actually even more influential.
Fair enough. Yeah. Also, like the first book in particular is like so horny, and it doesn't know that it is. Mm. It's very strange, but
you can skip the first third of the first book if you want.
I would. I would not have gotten through the first third of the first book if I had not had to read it for this podcast. But so anyway, yes. I've spent a month with this stuff, and I want to be done with it. So let's move on to the spoilers.
I read these books when I was 13.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that explains a lot because it actually doesn't, but...
But I feel like I definitely had a lot of unlearning to do as part of my, growing.
Oh, and as long as we're at it, there's, like, offhand references in this book to lesbian relationships between... a lesbian relationship between an adult and a child, which is seen as okay by everybody.
Well, we are talking about Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Yes, and speaking of which, let's go talk about Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Let's go talk about Marion Zimmer Bradley.
That wasn't actually the spoiler zone. This is the spoiler zone.
I actually feel like, to some degree, talking about the child molestation is the least, I'm not going to say least interesting, but it's sort of the part that everybody knows about by now. Mm-hmm. I think that there's some really interesting things to say about the ways in which this, con culture has really looked the other way on a wide variety of rape and sexual assault for decades. But like pedophilia in particular. The guy who ran Dragon Con for years wasn't like everyone knew he was a pedophile and nobody did anything about it. Until like the late 90s. This is
you know far more about Bradley than I do. I know nothing about her except...
Yeah, so I should say, Marion Zimmer Bradley was an extremely influential writer. She, for one thing, the Darkover books, and also, for one thing, the Mists of Avalon, actually like had real crossover out of science fiction into the literary and popular world. Lots of people read them. It's, the secret women's history of the Arthurian myth. And like everything Marion Zimmer Bradley writes, it has incest and it's supposed to be positive. But this, super influential, like feminist, literature, even though she herself did not consider herself to be a feminist. But also she nurtured a lot of women's careers. I mean, she had this anthology called Sword and Sorceress, of which I've read an embarrassing number of. And it was all fantasy about female characters. And this like actually launched a lot of careers. It's a lot of books that, you may or may not have a lot of authors you may or may not like recognize, but like Deborah Wheeler and Jennifer Roberson and Emma Bull, Mercedes Lackey. These are all people who got, if not their, who, didn't necessarily get their start, but like a lot of them launched some of the series that actually made them, there were some of their like major series. Elizabeth Moon, Diana Paxson, like these are, a lot of the female authors of, the 80s and 90s, got a big career boost out of Marion Zimmer Bradley, either both appearing in her magazine or in her female protagonist fantasy anthologies. And then also she just did a lot of mentoring. And so what this means is that there's a lot of authors who aren't necessarily that important these days, but who were real important when you and I were first reading science fiction and fantasy.
When you were, I was still reading.
Yes, you were still reading like Harlan Ellison's. Yes, you were still reading Harlan Ellison, and other things. But like there's an entire generation of science fiction fantasy authors whose careers were influenced in one way or another. Mostly women whose careers were influenced in one way or another by Marion Zimmer Bradley, which is probably part of the reason why nobody talked about the fact that. Right. Even,
so she's a load-bearing, high-status person within this insular, gate-kept scene, and therefore nobody is going to say you can't diddle those children, which is a tale as old as time. And as far
you
as
can't, find children for your husband to molest, because that was the open secret. Though it's funny because the either father, stepfather, uncle of one of the boys that Walter Breen molested. Were eventually got real mad, and understandably, about like the fact that nobody warned them. Nobody warned his family not to let their child spend time around Walter Breen. And so he put, they sued. First of all, he sued the family, and possibly also pressed charges. And second of all, he put like all the legal documents up on the web. I remember reading this back in like 2013 or something. And I remember, because that was when I first found out about it, and I was, horrified, and I wanted to learn more, and so I read through the website, and it was mentioned in the website that she had, molested her own children. But, like, somehow everyone ignored that part until her daughter came forward after her death. Mm. So, anyway, like I've said, it's real depressing. It's not surprising. This, Harlan Ellison and Isaac Asimov were also known for, not for assaulting children, but for sexually harassing and assaulting women, adult women.
This is true.
As, was just pointed out to me earlier today, David Eddings went to jail for a year for abusing his adopted children. There was a lot of horrific abuse that was going on in the science fiction community because it was a small, gate-kept community.
Yeah. And I should say that when I say, this is not surprising, I mean, it seems, this is sort of what we've seen with the speaking out and Me Too movements recently, is that essentially any community where people really, really want to be in the community, this is like exactly the same phenomenon as why you don't want to work for Disney or for a toy company or for a video game company.
Right.
Because the more passionate you are about it, the worse you will be treated, because being in there is seen as a privilege, and you don't want to be kicked out of Eden, so you'll put up with unbelievably shitty, workplace environment stuff. And
Yep.
it doesn't matter what the political side of it is or how enlightened the people are. It doesn't, I mean, it's just as true of the Catholic Church as it is of like public radio, WNYC,
Right.
As long as you have this hierarchical structure, this gatekeeping, and people who are really
basically
passionate about
anytime
it and
you
want to
have
be kept
hierarchy and passion and a lack of accountability, you're going to have sexual abuse.
And it's been mostly men because that's the way it is, but it's not as we see here, it is not exclusively a male problem.
Right. And you have this famous queer author, who writes about queer female author who writes about women among other things.
Should we talk about why we would call Marion Zimmer Bradley a queer author?
She identified as lesbian,
despite being married to a man.
Well, I don't think that they were having sex with each other. They were mostly having sex with children.
Woo! But yes. I feel the need to clarify that was a woo of dismay and not enthusiund. I mean,
she was openly a lesbian. She was openly a lesbian, and and a companion at marriage or whatever. Founded apparently on a shared love of child rape, and also science fiction.
Yes.
Anyway, part of the reason why I actually think it's really important for us to face up to this stuff is because what we see in fandom is like pushes to label people problematic and label people pedophiles for writing problematic stuff. But like, there's actual pedophilia that has been going on here, and first of all, like, there's no fandom that's been untouched by this stuff. There's no cultural anything that's been untouched by this stuff.
Yes.
But also, like, that before we throw, yell at people for call people pedophiles for liking, problematic fan fiction, let's, go after the actual pedophiles and their enablers.
And if you want to look for them, look in positions of authority.
Right, not at some random webcomic artist
some random
or fanfic writer
can
or
reach and destroy because they remind you of people who you can't reach and destroy.
Exactly. So this is why this is part of why I feel like it's of historical importance. Aside from, again, like 2 generations of fantasy ago, and actually 1 and 2 and 3 generations of fantasy ago. Tanith Lee's first book. Which I picked up the first edition of Tanith Lee's first book, and it has advertised on it that there's a foreword by Marion Zimmer Bradley because the preeminent female fantasy author, because, Ursula
the what?
I know. Yeah. No, but she was really powerful, socially powerful in the con scene.
I just want to point out again at this point, just briefly, that she's a bad writer. Like,
yes.
technically not proficient.
Oh no, we're going to get into that in a second. So anyway, yes, this, when you want to launch Tanith Lee's career, they asked Marion Zimmer Bradley to write a foreword. Now, and then stunningly and ironic in hindsight, they forgot to put the foreword in the book, which, when my first year in working publishing, that book was like my good luck charm, because I looked at it and went, there's absolutely no mistake I can make as a first year publishing assistant that's as bad as forgetting to put Marion Zimmer Bradley's foreword in this book.
Where Marion Zimmer Bradley's foreword is advertised on the cover. So let's also talk about Marion Zimmer Bradley's badness as an author and the way that she poisoned the well for fan fiction for a generation as well. Oh, go ahead.
So, we were going to get into the actual books because I do think they're worth discussing. There's, people have heard, authors can't read fan fiction because of legal things, and authors have to shut down fan fiction for legal reasons. And the story that people used to always cite about this is, there was this author, name always varied, who, a fan sent them an idea for a story and then later sued them over over writing a story that was similar to the idea that they sent them. This is based on an actual true story, which is, so Marion Zimmer Bradley had absolutely no, unsurprisingly, given that she's somebody who liked to take advantage of powerless people, she really had no sense of boundaries between her and her fans. Mm-hmm. So that she would, in fact, she would read fan fiction, she would comment on fan fiction, and then she would, in fact, publish fan fiction, like, fan fiction anthologies of Darkover fan fiction, published with, like, a reputable publisher, without really bothering to secure the copyright and permissions. And when she liked somebody's fan fiction, she would say, hey, can I pay you like $50 or $100 and use part of your fan fiction in my novel? And everybody, starry-eyed, went, oh, Marion Zimmer Bradley wants to use my fan fiction for her next Darkover novel? Of course! And, they'd take their $50 or $100 and they'd sign away all the rights. And finally, one woman said, how much of my story... No, she said, how much of my story do you want to use? Because if you only want to use, like, the basic idea, you can just use it. Though, obviously, I'll happily take, like, my $100. But if you want to use a significant portion of, like, my actual writing and my, like, plot, and, like, my specific plot points of this fan fiction, then I would like a royalty portion and a byline. And Marion Zimmer Bradley announced that she was never reading fan fiction again. She was never allowing fan fiction again. And she was also not writing, and she is also having to withdraw this entire novel that that had been contracted because, she had been taken advantage of, and it turns out that actually fan fiction is just too dangerous for authors to engage in because it will eventually stifle their own creativity.
Short silence left intact.
Thus, like I said, poisoning the well for fan fiction for an entire generation.
So I always thought this was all Anne Rice's fault.
No, she also Anne Rice hated fan fiction, but the actual story of an author getting sued by a fan is Marion Zimmer Bradley. Comes from this. Now, according to Marion Zimmer Bradley, she was threatened with it. She said, "Oh, I would love to use I've been inspired by your fan fiction, and I have a book that's not really based on it." But draws some inspiration from it, and I would love to pay you some money. And this woman said, actually, I'm suing you. I find the other version more credible, especially because there's more different people, including friends of hers, saying that is what happened.
Yeah, and that also tracks the whole backstory with like I read this first book and I was like, okay, I'm noticing a whole lot of like real basic stuff that a good writer wouldn't do, like repeating words within the same sentence or doing the standard I can't figure out which synonym I want to use, so I'm going to use all three of them in a row, kind of constructions. And then in the second book, I gradually noticed that wasn't happening anymore.
Right. That's because the vast majority of Darkover books... No, the vast majority of Darkover books from the 80s on were ghostwritten. Uncredited.
But then the last one, it starts doing that again.
Well, did you notice did you read the note at the beginning of the last one where she specifically says that she has taken the entire plot from an out-of-copyright novel? No, sorry, from an in-copyright novel.
No, that wasn't in the audiobook for some reason.
Oh, I wonder why. Let me pull it up. I'm going to read this because it's really funny if I can find it.
So she took the plot, but she wrote the prose, and therefore the prose is...
I don't know. Like, I don't know who ghost wrote every single one of her books.
I'd bet dollars or donuts the person who wrote the first book also wrote the third book. But
no, I don't think... No, I think that the first book she actually may have written, because that one was written in the 70s. Yeah. It's mostly the stuff from the 80s. Oh, I see what you're saying. So, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so she says, this novel, like all Darkover novels, is complete in itself, blah, blah, blah. Okay. No, that's a different note that she... here we go. Although every character and event in this novel is entirely my own invention, the theme and structure of the story were suggested by a novel by the late Talbot Mundy, The Devil's Guard, copyright 1926 by the Ridgway Company. I read it in 1945 or thereabout, and have felt for many years that this kind of ideal search or quest novel should be retold in a Darkovan context.
I see. So Shangri-La, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you can sometimes Wikipedia will list who is the uncredited ghost author. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have to look other places. But so anyway, Also, not only was she not a particularly good writer, but most of her books she didn't even write. She co-wrote or had them ghostwritten.
Very, very interesting.
I will say one good thing about her, which is that about the Darkover books, which is that it was the first time I ever saw a character with endometriosis sympathetically and accurately portrayed.
Yes. The biological hardships of being a woman are definitely detailed in great.
She had one character. One of her psychic feudal overlord characters had to drop out of the psychic relay tower because her cramps were too bad. And I remember going, wow, well, somebody is writing about this. That's about the one nice thing I have to say about these books. Looking back on them, but again, I read an embarrassing percentage of the series when I was a teenager.
Indeed.
So let's actually talk about these books.
Okay, that wasn't actually the spoiler zone. Here is the spoiler zone. Not another fake spoiler zone.
Yeah. So the.
Oh, sorry. One more real life thing that's really important, because you were mentioned how the Renunciates are kind of cult like, right?
Oh yeah, that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about.
So,
probably.
Did you know that there were real life Renunciates inspired by the Shattered Chain?
I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all. I imagine those communal houses were pretty grim.
Probably. I've been looking online and can't find any information about them. I know that they exist because Marion Zimmer Bradley actually wrote about them, mentioned them, and I don't think she would have lied about that, especially because she gave the names of specific women who had the Naha mother's name thing, and so
that's embarrassing, but also not unsurprising. So these books, right?
Now we're off to the spoiler zone. This is the spoiler zone. Finally, the actual spoiler zone. This is the spoiler zone. Part 4.
So yeah,
right.
No. The Renunciates, who are called the Amazons in the first book, and then it is revealed in the second book.
Then it is retconned that actually they don't like being called the Free
they don't
Amazons.
like to be called the Amazons. Are a network of women who have renounced this feudal society's the selection of roles for women that are available in this feudal society, which are basically chattel property for their husbands in one way or another, or noble women, or
virginal psychics locked away in a tower.
Nuns, basically.
Psychic nuns.
Psychic nuns. I mean, they're in the way that nuns in our world were meant to be sort of spiritual upholders of the.
Right, but the psychic nuns in these towers actually are doing weather control and message passing around, and also maintaining the feudal society.
Yes, although at least none of that really comes through in this trilogy.
No, there's a lot of stuff in this trilogy. There's a lot of stuff in the second book which is referring to earlier books.
Yeah, but in this particular trilogy, that's not really where our focus is.
No.
And so the sort of the striking thing about this group, which is it's sort of presented as, I mean, the first book's morals are extremely stark. It's you can be a woman who is ritualistically chained at the age of whatever it is, 13, when they're legally allowed to be married.
Yeah.
In the it's not actually the Muslim, the seraglio in the Arab world, but it pretty much is. She's just been kidnapped into the Sultan's seraglio.
Mm-hmm.
You can be that, or you can be a slightly less obvious version of that, or you can go and be a liberated woman here. And by the time the second book rolls,
you cut your hair, you drop your father's name, so that all you have is your mother's name as your last name, and you live in a commune with other women. Yes,
but in order to be into this to get into this commune. And by the way, this commune is the only game in town, because if you try to act like you're a liberated woman, I mean, this commune is like legally sanctioned in this society.
Yes.
And if you try to be like a free woman without joining this legally sanctioned cult, then they can legally just like dragoon you into it.
Yes.
And you have to do this oath where you renounce, basically like real marriage as it is defined in this society. I mean, you can take lovers, but you can't be a wife.
Or a concubine.
Or a concubine. You can't do anything for any man, and you have to keep your hair short, and you have to learn how to defend yourself, and blah, 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 blah. But
and you have to stand in sisterhood with all women.
Yes.
Even
of
as you look down on them.
Yeah, no, the attitude of the Amazons towards the other women is established immediately in the first book, but is ameliorated afterwards as people who are less insane start to write these things. Is openly contemptuous. This book hates women.
Yes.
I just want to point that out again. It's like they're the sort of the best parts of the book are women who haven't chosen to do this, explaining why they might not want to do this. But the contempt for women who don't like try to think their way out of this is palpable. And part of how that comes through is that the process of entering this, which again you have to if you don't want to be a trad wife in this society, is that you have to go through, or a nun, is that you have to go through.
But you can only be a nun if you have psychic powers.
Yes, that's that. As with
and red hair.
I mean that they back off on that again, and they back off on it only being women, and
occasionally you can be pale with like blonde or black or brown hair, but like most of them have red hair and 6 fingers.
Yes, there's a more than a little element of the same thing that you saw in Gossamer Axe with magical Irish.
Also, because I've read an embarrassing amount of these, you know where the 6 fingers part comes from? Interbreeding with an extinct alien race that's based off of the people in the Left Hand of Darkness, in that they are, gender fluid, and under the influence of sex pollen.
I was going to get to the sex pollen. I was like, is this the origin of that?
I don't know, but it's certainly like one of, she was certainly one of the popularizers of it.
Yes. But anyway, but the point that I'm making is that in order to enter this society, you have to go through cult deprogramming.
You have to go through cult deprogramming and then cult reprogramming.
Yes. I mean, which is what you do when you enter or exit any cult. Like that's what cult deprogramming is that the people who did it, studied the methods of cults and then used the methods of cults to get people out of cults. And in fact, what that was in real life was often, my son is going off to be part of the counterculture. We'll get the cult deprogramming guy to kidnap him and break him down so that he'll come back and be a normal person. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much where cult deprogramming comes from, but I digress.
Right. So first of all, they make you strip naked.
Yep.
Because
also all of these rituals are weirdly horny, but
all these rituals are weirdly horny. So they make you strip down, but also part of why they make you strip down is, and this is part of this turfy undercurrent I'm talking about, is because you could be a man infiltrating this women's only space.
Yes, exactly. They have to make sure, particularly because if you were so like self-hating as to go through the neutering procedure, which makes you into an amaska, you might look like a man. And the contempt and sorrow for these women who were so repulsed by their own femininity that they transitioned is
they transitioned into being like non-binary. But you'll note that all the sympathetic Imaskas, which is mostly Camilla, but there's also I think another one. They're all like people who basically people who desisted.
They saw the error of their ways and decided.
They're all people who detransitioned.
Yeah.
Like, they're detransitioned and now they're just real sad about everything they lost. This is what I mean. It's like serious turfiness.
Yep. No, it's real present. It's not subtle. If you want to see where the seeds of this kind of shit come from, you can look no further than this. But yeah, no, you have to strip naked and then you have to be and you take this cult, while women are staring at your vagina if they can't tell that that you have boobs. And you take the oath, and then you have to go immediately to a guild house and be shut in for 6 months. And when you are shut into the guild house, you are basically just emotionally abused for 6 months.
With consciousness raising sessions.
It's like,
and
it
self-defense.
is really astonishing. And it's like, I think I've mentioned this before, but I really recommend a book called The Stammering Century, which is a history of 19th century revival and utopian movements in America, and the convergent evolution of cults and utopian projects everywhere all seem to come to this particular place where it's like, you have to demolish the family structure. You send the children away. If you have a male child, you have to get it out of the house by, 6 years?
5.
Age 5, by 5 years old, and if you have a daughter, she has to become one of these people or be sent away.
And and when she turns 13, she has to be sent to another guild house. So
right,
she can't even be raised in your cult. She has to be raised in a different branch of the cult in another town.
Right. I mean, which is like the whole communal child rearing thing, which is common to most of these. And the other thing which is common to most of these is the consciousness raising sessions, which we talked about in the Amatka episode. But you have to stand up in front of all of these people and be challenged and insulted, and just the worst things that people can say to you, they have to say to you. And the idea is that this breaks down all of your received notions of what it means to be a woman, because you are wearing the, internal shackles of cultural programming. And so we got to break you down to nothing in order to raise you up again as a free woman. But in fact, what you were doing is raising you up again as a cult member.
Yes.
And
the fascinating thing about this is that you get to see your sort of enlightened Terran woman who, was raised partly in Darkover and mostly in Darkover, but also did was educated in the Terran Empire University or whatever. And who comes from this ostensibly more enlightened society. And it's extremely 1950s, and yet it really is still more enlightened than white supremacist feudalist eugenicists.
They all wear Star Trek TOS uniforms, which is a bit of a bad look, but yes.
Look, this entire everything by Marion Zimmer Bradley is a bit of a bad look.
Yes.
And anyway, so she comes, and you'd expect that, given that she's a trained anthropologist and spy, she would be going, yes, classic cult recruiting techniques. But no, she in fact still has to be broken down into realizing the ways in which she's been an oppressed woman.
Mm-hmm. And she undergoes essentially, I would call it like Wallace Shawn's The Fever for lesbians, is what she undergoes. Is like
Wallace Shawn's The Fever.
There's another one to recommend. So Wallace Shawn, who you may know as the as Fezzik, not Fezzik, the little guy from The Princess Bride.
Yes.
But who is also a big theater person and playwright, wrote a one-man performance, which is basically about the process of becoming enlightened into Marxism. It's like staring at the coffee cup and just trying to internalize how much human suffering and inequality went into every object around you, and and the consciousness of the sudden realigning of your consciousness with all of this new information. And Marxism and feminism work analogously here, because you have to reapproach all of your fundamental assumptions in order to get into this mindset. Causes a physical delirium to happen. And this play is spent with a person basically losing their mind and having an actual physical reaction to this process over the course of a few days in a hotel room.
Fascinating.
And what happens with both JL and Magda here, as they sort of learn about themselves through this culture shock, and are forced to reevaluate everything, is not only do they have to reevaluate anything, but they become more and more delirious over it. And this is also because their psychic powers are both awakening. Mm-hmm. And essentially psychic power it's psychic power in this universe is fucked up in a completely different way, because it's basically just, oh, you're an empath, huh? You can tell what people are feeling and thinking. It must be terrible to be head blind and not to be able to understand what people are feeling through the tone of their voices. It's women's magic.
Yes, I mean, they can. Well, there's also.
Oh, and some of them can like teleport and use cybolts, but that's not what this book is about. Right. That's a separate
that's
issue.
The men's magic mostly.
Yeah. But regardless, like, so she has, it's one of those things where it's consciousness raising. She comes through fear and trembling through this actual physical misery and transformation of her mind and madness, because they both like basically stop being able to tell what's real and what isn't after a certain point.
Soren Kierkegaard said you must approach God with fear and trembling. That's also how you must approach your house mother, with your clothes off so she can look at your vagina.
And what's being spoken out loud versus what's, they're just mind reading.
They become paranoid and they don't sleep, and they make really stupid decisions, which eventually leads to them being stranded in a cave and almost trampled by not buffalo, but
whatever the science fiction equivalent
caribou,
is.
Basically, musk oxen, whatever it is, antlered pack beasts,
moose.
Yes, they nearly end up being trampled by moose, because these brave and intelligent women have essentially just been ground into madness by the experience of trying to reckon with their own cultural preconceptions and culture shock. And that's the best thing that this entire trilogy does.
Yeah.
What I was just describing. That's the good part.
Yeah.
Because that's actually interesting.
Yeah.
But it is the Amazons.
And then the ending is such a letdown. The ending even of that book is such a letdown, where it's like, oh, well, actually, there's the renegade telepaths, and they'll just adopt you into their family of renegade telepaths, and then you'll get, everything that was, everything, no real damage was done, nobody was permanently hurt, everything wraps up very neatly and cleanly, and also, everything that was going on in your minds was just like your psychic powers waking up, and now we will get you proper training from, your like found family of characters from earlier books in the series.
Yes, I want to before we pivot away from it, I just want to point out that like the it's like beat for beat, and I don't know how. I mean, again, this is all convergent, but like it's bam, we tear you down, we cut you off from your friends and your loved ones and your family, and we destroy, and we are like, you can't trust anybody outside. You can't look at men when you're out, no communication with the outside world whatsoever. And we're mean to you and mean to you and mean to you. And then we all come and hug you and say that we love you.
Yes.
It's the cutoff followed by the love bombing. It's why Mormons send kids on a mission, so they can go and be rejected by the world and then, loved by their sisters. It's cult behavior 101, and it's fun that this book was written back before any of that was codified. She just instinctively knows how to bully people into submission.
And she was involved in a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. But it's really interesting just how these patterns all shake out the same way, because this is how you do this particular thing to other human beings. I also just want to point out that, like, do you remember the bit from the first book about what the Amazons did to a pair of sex workers who were, putting on lesbian shows for the men?
Oh, that's right.
Because not only do they drag them out into the street and beat them up, but they drag them out into the street, they beat them up and shave their heads. Not only do they drag them out into the street and shave their heads, they shave their pubes punitively, publicly, and then they tar and feather them.
And one of the other ones listening is like, too bad you didn't also light them on fire.
Yes, but it's like, why did you have to shave their pubes? What kind of sublimated garbage is going on here? What is happening in this person's brain?
I picked up this. Part of what makes Marion Zimmer Bradley's stuff so bad is that at no point is that like she just pours her issues straight into her writing.
Yes.
And like there's no grappling with it. They're just an uncomplicated good. I have this anthology of like feminist or women's science fiction from like the 70s. And it's got, for example, Ursula Le Guin and Vonda McIntyre, like all these, and I remember getting to the Marion Zimmer Bradley one and going, should I read this? I might as well read this. I mean, it's not like everything she writes has to involve rape or incest. It's about a woman stranded on a planet with her child, who eventually she and her child are like driven mad by,
sex pollen.
No, just whether or not, like her kid turns like 14 and is horny, and, they are driven mad by like whether or not they should be having sex.
Male or female kid? Never mind,
male
it
kid,
matter.
But like, no, it doesn't matter, right? Like, everything she writes is just like about sexual abuse and bullying.
I hope that Ikuhara doesn't. Anyway, we don't find out eventually that, but
not every. Here's the thing: not every author who writes problematic stuff is doing so because they just want to like pour their id and unresolved awfulness into their writing. A lot of people are doing,
which is why you shouldn't explode people on the internet for writing about this stuff. Maybe they survived
Not
this
everybody
stuff,
is Marion Zimmer Bradley,
or maybe they just want to write about it. Art happens.
Right. Sometimes people engage in issues in a variety of different ways, and not everything that engages with problematic material is inherently bad. The thing that makes Marion Zimmer Bradley so bad is that she is uncritically pouring all of the awful things that she was as a person into her fiction and expecting us as readers to like view this as good.
Leopards prowl the studios of the Duke de Berry's great chateau, where Cocteau's beast rehearses beauty's rape. Lewis Carroll marks his diary with a small white stone, as Kunioshi Kaneko prepares to paint. This song is by Momus, who to my knowledge has not committed any of the crimes he sings about. In life remain considerate, in art the devil's advocate. Art is sometimes how we work it out.
Yes. Like, this is the most clear in these books in the third book, in which Magda is now a big wheel in the science fiction community, I mean the Terran espionage community, and is being resented for her success by these, horrible up-and-coming selfish women authors, I mean spies. And so we need we get through this whole book and we get to an ending where not only is the woman who was mean to her die slowly, but she dies slowly in a way that makes Magdalene right all along.
Yes.
And means that she doesn't have to feel bad about the woman dying because her own friend also died, and she sacrificed her her wife lover to save this ungrateful bitch who had the temerity to resent her for being a gatekeeper in this community. And Magda has some like tormented introspection about whether it's really her fault that she's so great, and concludes that no, it's everybody else's fault that they resent me for being so great.
Yep.
I didn't make the legend of Magda Lauren / Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
It's really obvious.
It's also it's such a bad book. Like, it has the worst ending. And the thing is, it's not even a bad ending, like, an ending that made me mad, or an ending that, is like upsetting or thought-provoking. It just ends. Like, the story hasn't ended. It doesn't like end with them, getting to the city. It just ends with everybody being like, yes, Magna, you should go to the city.
Yeah. Well, it's like, so here's how I looked at it, reading just these three books and not having, exposure to any of the other stuff in the trilogy or in this
series.
world, is like the first book is like, okay, the world is fucked. The solution is to go to the women's cult. That's where you can be free.
Right.
The second book is like, oh, it's more complicated than that, which it is. Here we're going to look at these different cultures, and we're going to have a relatively reasonable, assessment of the pros and cons of these different cultures. We're going to see that like there are shitty people on both sides of the divide and good people on both sides of the divide, and there are good and shitty people who are both men and women, and we're going to wrangle with all of this. And then finally at the end of the second book, somebody points out the thing that most of us figure out eventually, which is that nobody's actually free. You can't find a way to get out of society. Society follows you everywhere because you're a human being. But then in the third book, it's like, okay, but now that we've established that and I'm successful and I'm still not happy, you know what I bet is the problem here is that I joined the wrong cult. And if I go and find the real
cult.
one,
right,
the real secret Shangri-La cult out there, that'll be the answer. And incidentally, the real secret Shangri-La cult are the people responsible for all the eugenics. That's the real truth at the end of the rainbow, is to embrace just the most gatekeepy, most secret society shit possible. So secret that we cannot even show you what it is. It has to remain off screen. It's that secret and important and deep.
I should also note that part of why the third book exists is to establish that Giles' daughter is just to establish a little bit of the history of Giles' daughter, who is brutally murdered in one of the first books written in the Darkover series. I believe she's brutally murdered for having sex with a man when she's supposed to be a psychic nun.
I'm just if I fall silent for long periods during this podcast, it's because I'm holding my head in my hands. Yeah, that's completely unsurprising. And like, what a way to kill JL, and for no fucking reason. She stopped getting character development after she was Marion's mouthpiece about how unhappy she was to be in this marriage. And so on and so on.
Did you notice that her awful husband, who's just a terrible, terrible person, suddenly, once in book 3, he becomes the head of like the entire Terran embassy on Darkover, and suddenly everybody's like, now he's a good guy. He wasn't a good husband, but he's a good man. Yeah,
and the thing is that was established at the end of the first book. Is like, he will become a good consul.
But the thing is that there's absolutely nothing in the first 2 books to suggest that he was actually going to be a good consul. Like, nope. He's not particularly smart. He's not particularly creative. He just wants to grab all the credit for himself. And
to be fair, neither is Magda, despite the fact that everybody says that she is. But that's
right.
That's a different story.
That's fair. But like, at least Magda isn't as much of an obvious brown noser.
Yes. Oh my God. I mean, the if we start talking about the various things that don't make sense here, this we'll be at this for another hour.
Right. But I mean, to some degree, this is what I mean. I feel like this sort of is in line with your thing about how this book actually kind of hates women. I mean,
yes. There's
the whole thing where like Peter is just objectively an awful guy in every way. He's not even particularly shown as being like particularly good at his job. He's not, he's a terrible husband. But like at the same time, they're failing, his 2 failed marriages with the 2 characters is really shown to be very much their own faults for, being hysterical and not, like he's awful, but they're shown as not being able to handle his awfulness.
Yeah, like just about, which would be their job.
Right, like it's shown as the sort of
just
the
like
marriage
it's
is a 2-part failure.
Lady Rohanna's job to deal with the awfulness of her husband,
Right.
Like that's sort of Lady Rohanna is sort of held up as a success,
right,
for being the Amanance Grease behind the throne with her awful, incompetent husband, and it's like, Magda could have been that,
right,
if she had been able to. If she'd been able to stand to do that. Right.
Also, I mean, like, I I guess it's not even worth getting into all the ways in which, as you said, the Terrans are basically just how Isaac Asimov imagined the future.
Yes.
There's no imagination there, but like you don't read Marion Zimmer Bradley for imagination.
No, everything in this book is taken from something else.
Everything is, yeah. But like, it's still just frustrating. It's frustrating that, they're set up to be so awful that we're clearly supposed to sympathize with the eugenics, feudalist psychics.
Yes.
It's just real depressing.
We are given this kindly old, sagely midwife who is senselessly murdered. A lot of women are senselessly murdered.
A lot of women are senselessly murdered, and yet
very few men are.
Almost
weirdly.
the man who just decides to run off into a snowstorm filled with sex pollen and trampling moose. He's fine. He just has a broken leg.
Like they don't even kill the evil sultan. They just cripple him.
Right.
It's like the women get murdered left and right, but even the worst men seem to escape. Like whatever happens to the incompetent, consul who hates being on this planet, we don't know. That happens off screen. Presumably he retires.
Presumably he retires and gets to go anywhere else, which is what he wants out of life.
Right, exactly. It's just the women who have to bear the brunt of all of this failure and who are raped and slaughtered in, some in like ways that come out of nowhere in a lot of situations.
Right, like some nameless bandits get killed.
Yes.
Like lots of people die like in battle. But it's always nameless people and women who die in battle. The men, any like named male character somehow manages to come away unscathed.
Indeed. I'm wondering if I can just go through a quick list of things that I found particularly annoying since I had to spend a month.
Please do, because given how much of this I've just been complaining about the author, I feel like now it's your turn.
Yeah, I've got a list of complaints.
Yes. There's as you pointed out, there's a lot of retconning. The Amazons go from being openly contemptuous of like midwifery and women's work in the first book to being all about it in the second book.
That's it. But their oath is always that saying that all women are supposed to be sisters.
Right. But they never behave like that.
Right.
In the first book, as JL's mother is dying, she kisses JL hungrily. And
I know.
This was because I was looking out for stuff like that. I was like, don't do that. Pick any other word, please. Yeah, the unnecessarily kinky punishment for stolen lesbian valor, as I mentioned.
The fact that even though there's a lot of people who have had sex with both men and women, everybody basically is either straight or gay. It's just they went through a phase.
That is true. There's no genuine bisexual representation afoot here. The book does the thing that where it points out how contrived its own plot is and says, "Oh, wizards did that," which I will not forgive in any book. Xandru is a really dumb name for Satan.
That's fair.
The complete lack of understanding of geopolitics that underpins the whole Terran Empire setup is breathtaking.
Oh yeah.
And you can't even blame that on the time. You should have known by then. Sorry.
By the 1960s. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, but it's like
this isn't even about the Cold War. How is this science fiction about the Empire and the Third World? And it's not even about it's not even informed by the Cold War. It's that disconnected from reality.
And also the far future Terran Empire is still really into Malthus.
Right.
Thinks that the Australian rabbit thing is a problem that is a eugenics problem rather than an invasive species problem.
I do love that. That's the one thing that brings together the Terrans and the Darkovans is that they're both really into eugenics because,
Yeah. Child labor is good, this book says.
Yep.
The weird thing where it seems to think that women are so horny that they constantly have to have sex or they go crazy. That's just the first book. That's the... I will say that I really enjoyed, again, the second book, probably because it was written by somebody else, has more like actually good moments in it. And I think my single favorite moment in the entire trilogy is when JL goes into the robot salon and is triggered because it looks like a torture chamber from her childhood.
Yes.
That's so nicely well observed. And also, like, if you wanted to view this as a critique of how fucking stupid this concept of the Terran future is, the robotic salon and, you know, perfumery with the makeup shotgun that shoots onto your face is high up there.
Okay, here's a pet peeve of mine. Is that all the Terrans are freezing because they wear synthetics, but the Darkovans are fine because, you know, they wear, like, good natural fibers. I mean, speaking as somebody who does a lot of hiking in a cold, and, like, snowshoeing in a cold part of the country, it's not all synthetics!
That's part and parcel of the whole mindset that drives this book, which is the utopian community appeal to nature thing.
Right.
Like, stories of 19th century utopian communities are all about people who are like, this urban environment with all this unnatural shit is what's killing us all and making us crazy, you know, all this processed food. All we have to do is go out into nature and it will provide for us.
I didn't get to finish the story, but it didn't work out well for anyone involved. You can't go out to the woods and become subsistence farmers on faith alone, particularly when the guy who's leading your new plant community doesn't help out with the work because he's too busy with his Bible. You know, the natural way is better. It's like the midwife is like, it is right that all these children that I couldn't save should die because they would have been weak and would have polluted the gene pool. But in the same way, it's like, yes, obviously you should wear furs and not a thin layer of polyester, which will be better for your mobility, for your warmth.
Okay, but like hikers today layer with a combination of synthetics because, first of all, even today you can buy synthetics that are actually really super warm.
Yes.
And so, you know, hikers today layer with like a combination of synthetics and wool and down, and you mix and match because some things, you know, are better when better than when they're wet, and some things are better when they're dry, and some things, you know, are better like wicking away your own moisture. Like you combine all of these things, and yet, so you've got this great metaphor right here with like how I walk to work in the winter. Of, you know, combining the natural and the synthetic to actually stay warm walking up the hill to Cornell. And yet she seems to have just completely missed.
Right.
There's an actual answer.
She's working from the left hand of darkness, which is all about how these cultural exchanges need to move towards synthesis.
Right.
You know?
Well, I will note that if you read The Left Hand of Darkness and the two things you think are, well, now I can write my sex-changing alien porn, and maybe I should make my my planet an ice planet instead. Like,
you weren't paying a whole lot of attention.
You weren't paying a whole lot of attention.
But yes, that is the thing. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the Forbidden Tower. I'm going to assume that this gets more attention in other books,
in earlier books. This is an annoyance part of me because this is actually where this reads like fanfic. It's like, oh yes, and then the characters from, like, you know, the really early important books show up randomly, and, you know, and like it reads like fan fiction.
Don't get me wrong, we are both pro fan fiction. There are things you can do with fan fiction that aren't allowed in normal straight fiction, including introducing a bunch of characters and assuming that your readers will already know who they are.
Cool, because I was like, what do these people have? What is going on here? Because, like, I was like, okay, the only way this makes sense to me is that I'm reading about the author's, like, found family home life, you know?
No, it's not that at all. I mean, I don't know about the actual author. But no, it's seriously the fan fiction thing where, you know, you've written this, like, whole complicated thing, and now, you know, now you get to bring in the canon characters to, like, make, you know, to sort of add their legitimacy to this novel, and also so that it isn't all about your OCs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
again, it's also establishing how Cleandori, who gets horribly murdered in an earlier book, how her parents met.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
What did you think about Jael's magical psychic abortion?
I mean, it's like that didn't feel too like, I mean, the whole, like, you see the baby coming to you from the overworld and then, like, sadly going away and be like, I'll be back later.
Right. And then she comes back in book 3. It's the exact same child. Right.
That's, I mean, I file that under, okay, you can believe whatever horseshit you want. This is religion as far as I'm concerned. But, like, as far as, a pregnant woman in that situation miscarrying, I don't,
Oh no, that
like
part
a reasonable thing to happen.
Sure, that part is reasonable. It's the whole, her miscarriage happens because, her child sadly concludes that she's not wanted and leaves, only to come back as the exact same child, like 7 years later or something.
Yeah, I mean, this is again, this is, I mean, despite the fact that there is a Christian, there are Christians on this planet who are looked down upon by pretty much everybody as a sort of a fringe cult that as with so many of these,
Jael's
the moral
brother gets sent, I believe, to the Christian monastery at one point.
Yeah, much like Lancelot's son in Spear. But as with a lot of like theoretically boundary pushing fantasy like this, there is there is a Christian cultural mindset underpinning a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the like weird Orientalism surrounding the wise men up in the mountains, or women in this case, up in the mountains in their, retreat, who have become enlightened and detached from the things in the world. That's like the sort of exoticized fascination with another way of looking at the world. But I would say that, like, the morality that actually underpins this, where mostly, like, people who are already subalterns, like women and such, are punished gruesomely for their, for not measuring up to their ideals. And like, you have an abortion and you see the ghost of the child sadly walking back into the grayness.
It's also worth some useful context here is that she was criticized in an earlier book for one of her characters isn't allowed to have an abortion because because of eugenics and like early colony population. So like all the women in the in the early Darkover are forced to have as many babies as possible. And aren't allowed to have an abortion, and she apparently got criticized by this for this, by readers, and so it makes me feel like this is sort of an answer to that, being like, oh well, fine, one of my characters can have an abortion.
Yes, and I'm going to treat it with all the seriousness that I'm capable of mustering.
Right.
But and again, but what you just described there, that's a porn premise. Like,
right.
Straight up,
yes.
And like, this is, a lot of the structure of the first, like the third book doesn't even have a structure. It's just a quest to nowhere.
Yeah.
But like the first and second book structures are extremely fanficky, in that where the climactic action sequence would go, a super serious emotional conversation between two characters goes instead. Mm-hmm. And
which
I don't mind
always,
that.
Yeah, I don't mind that either.
Yeah,
I don't feel like that's necessarily fanficky, because
that
you also get that in stuff that doesn't have action.
Yeah, but I mean, it's fanficky for this setting.
Yeah,
put it that way.
But no, honestly, I feel like more. I'm fine reading fantasy and science fiction where the climax is emotional instead of wizard battles.
Yeah, no, like my favorite part of the first book was the big conversation about what it has meant for Lady Rohana to be a wife to this person, like that with Jael and their, but like the sort of bonkers hurry up and wait structure, where particularly in Thundara House itself, where like things just bounce between these incredibly emotionally heightened conversations, and and huge bouts of like weird sublimated horniness.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is, fanfic to a T for me. And also, like, if the weird horniness wasn't sublimated, it might have actually been good.
Yeah.
You
Honestly,
know?
like, she could have just leaned into it.
We're both conditionally pro-horny.
Right. It reminded me of a webcomic called Feast for a King, which I don't recommend unless the idea of what I just described is like a story that is incredibly convoluted but is paced as nothing but incredibly intense emotional conversations out of nowhere interspersed with sex scenes. If that sounds good to you, you will love Feast for a King.
I'm sure it sounds good to some people.
Exactly. But it was like, why does Feast for a King succeed where this fails? Is because Feast for a King knows what it's doing in that way. It's like, this is the sex part. This is the feelings part. This is the sex part. We're here for the sex and we're here for the feelings.
Right.
The author is taking all of their Neopets OCs, that's literally what happened, and is doing this with them.
Again,
like, that's fine.
Again, that is fine.
Exactly.
It's... Yeah, and it's funny because, like, the actual sex scene, like, she skips over all the sex.
Yes! It's weird.
It's real weird. Like, I can't even remember if Magda actually has sex with what's-his-face and in his
not on
apartment
screen.
or not. I mean, the way that she keeps thinking about it makes it sound like she had sex with him. Monty, that's his name.
Monty, yeah. No, she does. It's implied that she has sex with him, but yeah, no, that sex scene is incredibly like vague and just.
It's so vague that like at first it's like I guess she
Hays
didn't
Code
have...
movies. She's taking off her clothes and then she's putting her clothes back.
Well,
on
yeah,
again,
and she sort of is going, oh, I don't actually want to do this, and so she says some remark about, oh, I'm not even going to have, well, I can't have sex with somebody if I don't know your name. And then it fast forwards, and she keeps thinking about it as if they've had sex. So, like, clearly they've had sex, but like, it's so circumspect about it that you can't even actually tell.
Yes,
and you can't.
And this is as we've mentioned, interspersed with things that are like, if they were viewed within the like in a proper context, would be extremely horny, way more horny than just two people banging on a couch.
Well, and yeah, exactly. Well, and I mean, like, occasionally you get flashbacks. You get, like, rape flashbacks occasionally, and those are explicit.
Yeah.
It's like the only explicit sex that happens in these books is assault.
And, in the scene in the first book in the shelter house with the men, I mean, where Magda accidentally attracts the attention of the bandits, and they start, they prelude to a gangbang her before the rest of them show up. Like, the way that is described, again, reads like porn, right up until the point where it doesn't, right? And it's like, somebody, far be it from me, to suggest that this author was a little bit confused about sex, but you know what I'm trying to say here.
And when Magda and Camilla finally get together,
entirely off screen.
Yes. However, the telepathic merging in book 3 between Magda and Jael, super horny.
It's very strange. It's very strange. It's the stuff that is just below the surface that always seems to be the malignant stuff. Right. It's like, just bring out what is within you, and maybe that will cause fewer horrible consequences for all the people around you in the long run. Hey. But
if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Jesus said that. Or at least according to the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said that. He probably wasn't thinking about authors and their horniness, but they should listen, 'cause it's Jesus.
So I would just like to end this with my favorite terrible Marion Zimmer Bradley anecdote, which is very short.
Okay.
Another much more healthy, weird horny fan thing that I was into as a teenager was ElfQuest.
Oh, I love ElfQuest.
I love ElfQuest too.
Yes.
Marion Zimmer Bradley hated ElfQuest, and in fact went up to the author Wendy Pini and said very meanly, was very snotty to her and was like, about her terrible comic, and said, "Elves don't have cleavage."
Yes, they do. Thank you very much.
I feel like in terms of this really encapsulates so much about,
Yes,
sort of...
Marion, I know that you want your elves to be like flat-chested Tinkerbell types, and we know why, but, you don't have to yuck somebody else's yum.
Right, well, and the thing about ElfQuest is that ElfQuest understands that it's, horny elf comic.
Yes!
And has a lot of fun with it.
Yes! That's fine.
Exactly.
I enjoyed it as a 13-year-old boy on the level on which I was supposed to enjoy it.
Same as a 13-year-old not boy.
Yes.
Anyway, so I felt like that, really encapsulates a lot of what we were just saying about how all the sexuality in these books is unhealthy and sublimated in awful ways. And there's this disdain for any kind of healthy sexuality.
Yeah. Well, I think that we did. I feel like I need to stretch and take some deep breaths after that one. But
this is good. I feel like I've exorcised some demon from like my 13-year-old self.
I'm glad. Despite the fact that I didn't really enjoy spending a month with it. I mean, I kept reading these books. You told me that I didn't have to read all three of them.
I said, really? I said, get through the second one. At least get to the consciousness-raising scenes in the second one so that you understand part of what's going on.
Yeah, and I did.
And then you kept
that
reading.
was the best part of the whole thing.
Right.
So I kept going, hoping for good stuff, and was largely disappointed.
I did warn you that the third one was awful.
Yeah. But regardless, I'm glad to be moving on to something else. And what, in fact, we are moving on to, last I checked, was our second short story.
A short fiction roundup. So I will
short fiction roundup.
Yes.
It's actually gonna be Siren Queen, so disregard all the following.
I will pick the stories. I have not yet picked them. Sorry. I will pick them, I guess, tonight.
All right.
So sorry, guys. We cannot tell you what stories are up because I have not actually gotten around to picking them because I've been busy moving.
By the time this goes up, we will already know, and we'll already be up on our big list of forthcoming episodes. So
yes.
Check those out if you want to read along.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting up with an hour and a half of Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Sorry.
Again, I agree with you that this needed to be done, but now, thankfully, it is done.
Thankfully, it is done, and we can move on.
Indeed. Goodbye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye, everyone. Sorry.